Welcome everyone to Have History Will Travel. I am your host, the Wilder Historian, and this video is going to be a little bit different. I just returned from a trip out west where I visited a whole bunch of national parks, and I wanted to share that journey with you. There are a whole bunch of historical stops that I made, and it is my goal to go to every national park in the U.S. And so I wanted to take you along this journey. I left out on the evening of the 4th of July and drove through the night. My first stop was the grave of my 5th great-grandfather, who was buried in Missouri. He had traveled out west to seek his fortune, but had left part of his family in Lee County, Virginia, where I was born and raised. He was a veteran of the War of 1812, and he actually lived through the Civil War. Not that he fought in the Civil War, but he actually saw it take place. He finally passed away in 1874. The next stop was Sioux City, Iowa, where I visited the grave of Sergeant Floyd, the only man to pass away during the Lewis and Clark expedition. I pulled into Chamberlain, South Dakota on the evening of July 5th, and then I woke up the next morning and headed to Badlands National Park, one of the most amazing geological features you'll find in the United States. I stayed there for about an hour and then quickly moved to Mount Rushmore, one of the greatest national treasures that the United States has. Then I moved on to Devil's Tower, Wyoming, which has a special meaning to me because my grandfather was in the Civilian Conservation Corps and helped build that national park. Next, I drove to Buffalo, Wyoming, where I spent the night. The next morning, I woke up and drove to Bighorn Canyon National Recreation Area, where I got to see the Yellowstone Dam. It's an amazing place to go visit and has a beautiful Native American story about how the canyon got its name. Then I moved on to the Little Bighorn Battlefield, one of the most important places to me, because it got me into history, or at least it was one of the most important things that got me into history, and specifically the Civil War. It put me on this trajectory to getting my PhD in Civil War history, and so I had to stop there when it was along this route. I'm going to talk about the influence that the Little Bighorn Battlefield had on me as a child, learning about U.S. history, and why it got me into Civil War history, even though it did not take place during the Civil War. The last half of the day, I drove to Conrad, Montana in preparation to go into Glacier National Park. The next morning, I woke up and went to Glacier, parking at Logan Pass and hiking to Hidden Lake. I can only describe the hike to Hidden Lake as spiritual. It was one of the most amazing experiences I ever had, and I highly recommend people going to see Glacier. It is something that you cannot put into words or into pictures. After my hike, I drove to Helena, where I spent the night, and then the next morning woke up and drove to Yellowstone National Park. I highly recommend going to the northern entrance where you can see the arch, but then I drove to the Lamar Valley in Yellowstone, and if anyone remembers an old TV show called Wild America, that's where I got the inspiration to go to the Lamar Valley. The Lamar Valley has captured my imagination since seeing that TV show at 5 years old, and 26 years later, I was able to go right there to it. I then drove on the John D. Rockefeller Jr. Memorial Parkway to Grand Teton National Park. I wish I'd have had more time at Grand Teton, but I did visit multiple visitor centers to understand the human as well as the natural history of the park. It is absolutely fantastic, and I did get some great pictures there. By the end of that day, I had drove to Pocatello, Idaho to spend the night. Then the next morning, drove to Golden Spike National Historical Park, where I got to see a recreation of the Jupiter and the 119 meet where the Transcontinental Railroad came together. It was probably one of the most fun experiences, and if you get a chance, please go to the Transcontinental Railroad's meeting place at Golden Spike National Historical Park. You will not regret it. Then it was off to Fossil Butte to learn about the pre-human history of the United States. Then I drove on to Cheyenne, Wyoming to spend the night. While in Cheyenne, I met with one of my subscribers and fellow YouTuber Joe from the channel Wyoming Traveler. The next morning I traveled to Fort Laramie National Historic Site, where I got to see Old Bedlam, the bachelor's officers' quarters there. It had one of the best representations of a store in the mid-1800s that I've ever seen. Wonderful rangers there that helped me out trying to figure out all the different locations that many of the officers in the Civil War were stationed at in the West. After Fort Laramie, I went to Agate Fossil Beds, where I got to learn about more archaeological digs about the pre-human history of the United States. Then I went to Scotts Bluff, a major route along the Oregon, Mormon, California trails, and the Pony Express. At Scotts Bluff, they have tunnels you can drive through, a nice look-off point. It's really worth your time to stop in and see that. After I went to Scotts Bluff, it was a 19-hour drive back home.
Historian, historian, where do you roam? Historian, historian, far, far from home. Have history will travel reads the card of a man, a professor with knowledge in the heartland. To educate the world is his mission. A professor of fortune is a man called historian. Historian.